This is Lewis Hart for Boxing Social in association with Empire Fight Store and William Hill. Delighted today to be joined with Dan Rafael. I mean, you was lucky enough to be there. I weren't lucky. I had to watch it through the TV, but I mean, incredible. There's no one I'd rather speak to after Saturday night after watching Terence Crawford defeat Errol Spence, stopping him in the 8th round. I mean, how are we feeling after that? How are you? How was Vegas? How was the whole experience?
Yeah, stopped him in the 9th round, but it
Oh,
was a
ninth round.
tremendous. What can you say? I mean, it was a Hall of Fame caliber performance. It was the kind of performance where if there's any dispute or doubt about who is the #1 fighter pound for pound, I think he put his stamp on that 100%, that it is, in fact, Terence Crawford is the best boxer in the world at this moment. And, you know, he lived up to everything he said he would do. I don't even think Terence Crawford thought it would be that quote unquote easy. I mean, he made the point after the fight that, yeah, it looked easy, but that, you know, we don't get to see all the hard work that goes in leading up to the fight. So, you know, I take him, you know, I know exactly what he means, but from our point of view, a fan, a media, somebody watching just on pay-per-view, whatever, he made it look easy. I mean, he just completely took Errol Spence apart. Everything that Errol does well, he took away from him. And Crawford just looked absolutely fantastic. And I've had, and I am of this opinion also, but people that have been around a lot longer than me, whose opinions I respect a lot, say things like that version of Terence Crawford would give a good test or win against anybody you could think of. And they talked about people like Sugar Ray Leonard and Floyd Mayweather and Manny Pacquiao. And, you know, you pick a great welterweight and Crawford's in that. He's in the conversation. Like, he may not win all those matchups fantasy wise, but he certainly would be competitive and win some of them. So he proved himself to me anyway that he's the real deal. I mean, I've always known he's the real deal, but he finally got the opportunity to show it against a similar A-level opponent, and he did the job.
In terms of every fight you've covered, been covered so many fights, where does that performance from Terence Crawford rank on a singular sort of performance from one fighter?
Well, I mean, it's definitely up there. I mean, in terms of I was thinking about the types of fights where there's a lot of anticipation going in, where people think it's going to be a highly competitive, you know, very good fight, or where there's a fight where there's an underdog and the underdog may win and do so, not just eke it out, but win in pretty emphatic fashion. And so I've been asked this also since the fight, a few fights that come to my mind where, you know, you get like sort of the virtuoso performance, the as we call it, the tour de force.
Yeah.
Bernard Hopkins against Felix Trinidad. Trinidad was the favorite, and Bernard just completely took him apart and knocked him out. Bernard Hopkins did a similar thing to Kelly Pavlik when he was the underdog, although that went the route in a light heavyweight, 170-pound fight. One of my most memorable performances at a big level, unfortunately, Trinidad was the victim once again, was when he boxed Winky Wright.
Oh, yeah. 100%.
He went there and just shredded him for 12 rounds. This is a fight that I wrote a lot about, but was not in attendance because I did not go overseas for the fight. But when our American super middleweight champion, Jeff Lacey, traveled to the UK and took on in a unification fight Joe Calzaghe, and Joe was an underdog in his own home area, and he basically ended Jeff Lacey's career that night in many ways by just completely dominating and beating up on him and winning, you know, a one-sided decision that was as outstanding as you can get. So there's those types of fights, and of course, one I always think about is Manny Pacquiao as a big underdog against Oscar De La Hoya. Manny was moving up 2 weight divisions, and a lot of people, when that fight was made, thought this is a death match, that Manny Pacquiao was he's going to die in the ring. There were literally people that were concerned for Manny Pacquiao's health, including people in the Filipino government. And Manny Pacquiao went in there and not only beat up and hammered and destroyed Oscar, he sent him into retirement. So it was on that level of those type of historic performances what Terence Crawford did to Errol Spence, and it might be the best of all of them because of what was at stake. All those matchups I just mentioned to you, they were not matchups that were between 2 undefeated fighters for the undisputed title, you know, at that, you know, in the 4-belt time. I mean, it was just a remarkable performance. What can you say?
Definitely. And I think the special thing on where you rank these types of performances would you consider it sort of a legacy type performance? Because in a way, Crawford almost sort of matched Spence at his own game in terms. I think I've got a stat here. He sort of landed 42% of his overall jabs, which is a big weapon in Errol Spence's arsenal, and the body shots as well. So when you think of performances like that from Crawford, almost nullifying what Spence does well, Crawford done that even better than him, which makes it even better. Would you say?
Yeah, 100%. I mean, he took away Errol's best weapon, which is the jab. It's one thing to be able to take away your opponent's best weapon, whatever it may be, but to be able to turn that aspect of their game into your best attribute in the fight, turn it completely the other way, exactly what he did. So Crawford, he's always had a good jab, but it's never been like the headline. It's never been the big thing he's been known for. But he not only took away Errol's greatest weapon, but he turned his into a devastating weapon. He spoke about it at the news conference after the fight, where he talked about how when they train, he basically used what he called the flick jab.
Yeah.
But because he knows the power and the accuracy and how steady Errol Spence's jab was, they made the decision in their training camp to practice and work on their jab to deliver with more power. And that's what he did. There was no such thing as a flick jab in that fight. Errol Spence delivered his jab with very good power. It was a power jab. It was, I made the joke. I felt like I'm watching the welterweight version of Larry Holmes, not the Terence Crawford, again, who we've seen with a nice jab that fit nicely into his overall arsenal. But he made this like one of his most significant weapons in this fight, and he was knocking Errol Spence back with the jab. It doesn't count in the stat sheet as a power shot, but it came out like a power shot. I mean, you mentioned his stats for the jab. I believe he landed 50% of his overall punches.
Yeah,
which
it was 60% of it. He's landed. It's 50% of total and
yeah,
60% of power punches as well. So
listen,
yeah,
when and again, I've said this 1,000 times. I don't live and die by the CompuBox, but it serves as a tremendous guide to a boxing match, to a fighter's career, to their how the what kind of trajectory they're on. Let's say when it comes to their punching. I don't care if you're fighting a complete scrub or you're fighting a elite fighter like Errol Spence. If you land 50% of your punches overall, you're almost always going to win the fight. That's a high number. I've seen lots of fights at this top level. A guy might land in the 40%. It is extremely rare where a fighter at that caliber is landing 50% of their punches. That's like a recipe for disaster for the opponent.
Yeah. Yeah, definitely. And another thing, did you see the effectiveness of Crawford coming out in southpaw? I know we know how good of a switch hitter he is, but initially step 10 in the southpaw stance, how effective did you think that was for the fight?
Well, it's very effective. Terence is one of those guys who for many years was just listed as a right-hander, but he would switch up all the time and box large portions of his fights as a lefty. So he'd come out and box right-handed for, a first round or two, and then suddenly he changes and you'd see him box that way the rest of the fight. So I think most people expected against Spence that, he would be a southpaw for large stretches. If I'm not mistaken, he came out as a southpaw pretty much in the opening bell. And I really remember seeing him switch up that much during the fight. So that's another tremendous aspect of Terence Crawford's game, is that it's hard enough to deal with him in general, but he is very capable of being a dominating fighter, whether he's fighting in a left-handed stance or in a right-handed stance. So I'm assuming that, you have to assume that Errol Spence, that, him and his team knew what Crawford's abilities were with each hand. So I'm sure that they spent part of their camp, training for a right-hander as well as a left-hander. But, he was able to fight as a southpaw basically the entire fight and not have any problems. In other words, you don't fix what's not broken. If you come out and you're having success as a lefty, there's no reason to start switching up when you're dominating.
Definitely. And you was obviously there on Saturday night, and not just there, but for the whole week as a whole. When you see fights like this where two fighters come together, the best of their sport, how special do you think the whole event was as production? Everyone's sort of talking about how great Crawford was, but it takes two to tango. So the whole event in itself, how special do you think that was?
Listen, it was terrific. It was outstanding. I mean, look, I think when the year is over, the biggest fight of the year from a overall viewership and pay-per-view and revenue, including the gate, it will be the fight that took place in April between Gervonta Davis and Ryan Garcia. And that was a huge event, also at the T-Mobile Arena. But for my money, and I was at that fight also, but for my money, this fight between Errol Spence and Terence Crawford is the most significant fight of the year. It probably won't reach the levels of revenue and overall business in terms of the commercial aspect as the other fight. but from a historical perspective and the meaning to the sport and the implications in terms of the championships and of pound for pound and those types of things, this was the biggest fight of the year. And I don't see anything on the schedule that comes close to it in that level. I mean, yes, we've got lots of top-notch guys who are going to fight between now and the end of the year. You got Canelo Alvarez coming up in a big fight against Charlo. There's going to be other fights. We'll see. Hopefully, we got Anthony Joshua coming back. Hopefully, we'll see some other big heavyweight fights before the end of the year, and plenty of other good matchups that will take place. But nothing's going to achieve this type of level. And so when you have that kind of a fight, I was happy to be out there and see like other media that doesn't often come to the fights there. Like the New York Times covered the fight. That's obviously, in the United States, that's the most important publication that there is. So that gave me a good feeling. When the best fight the best at that level, it's going to get attention. We'll see how the pay-per-view numbers did. I assume it's going to do well. But like I said, I don't think it's going to reach the level of a Tank and a Ryan fight, but that doesn't mean it's not a success. And look, you have to give a lot of credit to the fighters because Errol Spence was not letting this fight go. He said to me and others over the last couple of years that he would feel incomplete if he left the welterweight division without having this matchup with his natural rival, Terence Crawford, for the undisputed title. Obviously, it takes two to tango. So even though it took a while and Crawford was tough during the negotiation and he had certain things he wanted and, he was not going to make the match unless he had certain things the way that he was comfortable with. But eventually, he's a competitor also, and I know how much he wanted this fight. He got it, and they did the business. I thought they conduct themselves with class, with pride, and in the end, Crawford was the better guy. And I have to tip, he did a great job, Crawford. But and I wrote a column about this that's on my newsletter. I've been doing this for a long time, and I don't know if I've ever seen a fighter lose a fight in this kind of level of a matchup that showed such character and such class in the way he took the defeat. I mean, I'm sure it's hurting him inside real bad. He didn't want to say it on the, when he was asked about it, but these are not losses. You just wake up the next morning and go about your business. But Errol Spence is a man's man. He acted like with so much class and so much humility. How do you not love the guy?
Definitely. One thing in the post-fight presser from Terence Crawford, he was talking about the disrespect he received from the media, him saying that people saying he was too small, etc. How did you react, and what were your sort of thoughts on them comments from him when he was saying that and talking him about proving people wrong?
I'm not really sure where he's coming from for that because a lot of people had him number one pound for pound going into this fight, or certainly in the top, 3 or 4. I mean, for myself, I've always respected Crawford's abilities. You could watch him and knew he was a terrific fighter. But one thing that I would take issue with Crawford on is, he would get upset when people would say he didn't. I'm not talking about lightweight or junior welterweight, but since he became a welterweight, he didn't have a great resume. It wasn't his fault. So
That's
never one time did I ever believe that Terence Crawford wasn't willing or interested to fight the best guys. It just because the way that the promotional situation was lined up, he was with Top Rank on ESPN, and Errol Spence was with PBC fighting either on Fox or Showtime. Fox is no longer involved, but they were for a time at that moment. And he was not able to get the biggest fights. So, Thurman was over there. He didn't fight Errol, but the other guys did. Danny Garcia and Ugas and Lamont Peterson, and he got the ability. Mikey Garcia, he got the chance to fight some of the bigger, better names, whereas Crawford was over on the other network, and Top Rank was struggling to find him opponents. So they had ultimately they found him like the faded Amir Khan. He was able to fight Kell Brook, but way after Kell was kind of on the way out. Way after Errol had defeated him. So he went through a group of challengers that were okay, but nothing that was going to set the world on fire. So he got criticized for the lack of opposition, even though it wasn't his fault. So my way of looking at it is this: you can be critical and say he didn't fight anybody as a welterweight, but you could also say he's a great fighter. In other words, the two are not, both can be true at the same time. So now he finally got the opportunity to fight the number one guy besides himself, and you saw what happened. So now that no longer applies. He has had the big fight against the big name, and he didn't just win; he won handily. So going into the fight, I think the criticism of his opposition was warranted. It wasn't directed towards him; it was the circumstance that he just couldn't get that big name, or a big name that was maybe still at a top level. But that did not change the fact that he was a tremendous fighter. You could just know that watching what he did when he was in the lightweight division, certainly when he was rolling through everybody and becoming undisputed in the junior welterweight division. But I don't think we have to have that argument anymore. Terence Crawford has stamped himself as a great fighter. There's no doubt. He would hang with anybody in the welterweight division over time.
And are we now living in the Terence Crawford era, the first person to become two-weight undisputed champion, vying for more? We'll get onto that in a bit, but are we living in the Terence Crawford era now?
That's a good question because I'm not sure how long it's going to last. I actually posed the question to Terence. It was, I believe, the final question of the post-fight news conference, which was, okay, if Errol is going to opt for the rematch, obviously you'll have to deal with that. But once that chapter of your career is closed, once the Errol Spence chapter is closed, whether there's a rematch or there's not a rematch, what other things do you want to do in your career? I mean, is it defending your title at 147? Obviously, he's going to have mandatories that are due. Is it a matter of going maybe to junior middleweight and trying to get a fight there? Obviously, Charlo is the champion, undisputed, and he's got the fight coming up against Canelo Alvarez, so they can't make that fight right away. And I think even if they could, there's a good chance that maybe all the belts wouldn't be at stake, but there's still, other fighters in that weight class. Do you maybe want to go to middleweight someday? In other words, what's in your, on your line? Have you even given yourself a second to think about that? Because obviously this fight with Spence was so dominant in his mind. And Crawford's response was, look, I'm going to be 36 years old in 2 months. And I don't know. I got to sit down with my team and think about what I want to do in the future. I've been boxing since I'm 7 years old. I've been doing sports since I'm 7 years old. So it's a long time. And, I don't think he's going to retire in his, right away. I think he thinks, okay, I've climbed this mountain. I've achieved this goal. I've made history as the first male to win the undisputed title in the 4-belt era. And I got to think about what else is there for me to do in terms of what interests me and what's obviously the biggest thing financially. I suspect he'll be back in the ring. When and against who, it's hard to say, other than the prospect of if Errol Spence actually does formally sign and invoke his right to an immediate rematch. And there's the off chance that maybe he'll have the think better of it and not do that. I suspect he will, and we'll see that fight probably before the end of this year. And then after that, if Crawford wins again, which I think most people would make him the big favorite this time around, then we'll have to wait and see. But I think that Terence Crawford fighting a quality fighter like a Charlo at junior middleweight is a very attractive, interesting fight. And if you want to stay at welterweight, they may not be the mega fights, but Stanionis is an excellent contender. He's his mandatory in the WBA. Jaron Buatsi is his mandatory in the IBF, also a superb young fighter. So there'd be fights that would interest people. They just may not be on the same level of fighting Errol Spence. And by the way, few fights he could have in the future are at that level.
Exactly, because I was going to touch on that because I listened to the post-fight presser and I was going to talk about your question about sort of the motivation for Terence Crawford, because Errol Spence was always that heel. So could we potentially look at a potential where if they have the rematch, could that be the end of Crawford? Could he do you think it's a realistic prospect where he could sort of have this potential rematch with Spence and then just call it a day?
You never say never. Anything like that's possible, obviously. From the Crawford point of view, though, as long as he has motivation, I don't know why he would call it a day. He's not even, it's one thing when you get to that level, you finally have the biggest fight. Guys are usually they're closer to the end. They're on the way out. We've seen those types of fights happen where we wait, we finally get it. And it sort of spells, the end of that guy at the top and they, peter out. But Terence Crawford has never even come really close to losing a fight. Never been, officially knocked down. Never been, in my recollection, badly hurt in a fight. I've covered pretty much his whole career. I've covered numerous of his fights. I think that was like my 14th fight I covered of his in person. So I don't know why he would retire when he's finally now at a point where he can make his biggest money. As long as he's motivated to do it. I think he can have a few more good years for sure. Like I said, he's only 35, and in boxing today, that's not necessarily old. He's always in good condition. He can certainly move up in weight, so he's not going to struggle at making 147. So I think, look, I don't usually take what guys say at the post-fight press conference as gospel. I feel like they say it because they believe it at that moment, but they're also in the emotional vortex, if you will, of moments after a fight. So you kind of have to take it with a grain of salt. So I think once Crawford, unwinds and decompresses a little bit, debriefs, if you will, after what occurred Saturday, I'm sure he'll do some interviews and when he finally gets a quiet moment, maybe takes a little vacation or just relaxes at home with his wife and kids, and starts to think a little bit about it. Yeah, I'm sure he's going to fight again, and it's just going to be a matter of who and when. And obviously, the immediate question of what he does next is not in his hands because he has to wait to see if Errol Spence formally invokes his contract right to the immediate rematch. And in the before that happens, I would suspect that over these next days and a couple of weeks that Errol Spence is going to have to do some soul searching. Also, does he really want to have that rematch? Does he want to really take another ass kicking like that? I mean, that's a question that he and his family are going to have to talk about.
Definitely. Well, we'll get on to Spence in a minute, but one thing I wanted to say was when Terence Crawford was dropping Errol Spence, he was pointing over to his stablemate, Jermell Charlo, who you mentioned earlier, saying, you're next. I want you next. I know Charlo has bigger fish to sort of worry about at the moment. He's got Canelo and potential Tim Tszyu when he comes back down. But do you think that there's already sort of the narrative already played there? Stablemate who's calling him out after beating Spence for a big fight when the time's ready.
Look, even before the fight between Charlo and Canelo was finalized, Crawford had mentioned his name as somebody he'd be interested to fight. Yes, there is that aspect that if he were to fight Charlo, it's another one of the Derek James fighters. To see if he can go 2-0 against them, it would be for obviously the undisputed title. I mean, it's a pretty big deal if he can do that fight. I mean, I think that'd be a tremendous fight. I mean, I would like to see that actually. I would be a lot more interested in watching Terence Crawford go to 154 and challenge Charlo than I would be to see him fight a rematch against Errol Spence, which I feel like you kind of know the outcome already. And even if it's a slightly different fight, is there going to be that much public interest in seeing a rematch after what occurred? Especially if it's at 154, which is what Errol would like it at. The way their contract works is the loser of the fight had the right to invoke an immediate rematch, but the winner of the fight has the right, this is according to the two fighters, has the right to set the weight either at welterweight or junior middleweight. So if Terence Crawford was open to the junior middleweight aspect of it when he spoke at the news conference, but if they were to do the rematch at 154, there's no titles at stake. So it would have, from the general public's point of view, it's not a title fight, whatever. I mean, I don't care about that, but some people would view that as it's not as big of a deal if it's not for a world title. So, they'll have to figure all that out.
Do you think the weight played a big factor in terms of Errol Spence's performance?
I mean, I don't see how you can say it didn't have something to do with it, but Errol, again, as I mentioned, how classy he was and how much character he showed in defeat. He was asked numerous times at the press conference about different things. Basically, he was given openings to take a different route and make an alibi, to make an excuse. He was asked, your face started to swell up, your eyes started to swell up early in the fight. Were you having trouble with your vision? Was that a problem? No, I didn't have any problem seeing out of my eye. Didn't take the bait on that. Errol, how did you feel when you came in the ring? Did you feel okay? Didn't take the bait. He could have said, I had an upset stomach or this or that. Said, no, I felt cool. I'm good. Didn't take the bait. Asked about the weight. Said, look, I'm a grown man. I made the decision and the promise to make the weight. I made the weight. No excuses. Hats off to the champion. So Errol was given any number of outs, if you will, to make an excuse. And the questions were perfectly reasonable and legitimate from my media colleagues, but Errol just wasn't going to go there. So whether they were true or not, he just was not going to detract from what Crawford had done. He was not going to make himself look like a sore loser. I respect that from now till the day I die. It's very rare that you see that, where even when guys are respectful and show class like that, there's usually some small little thing, well, my hand hurt, but no excuses. Well, yeah, you just made an excuse.
Yeah.
Errol didn't say anything like that. So I believe he had trouble making the weight. I said so in a couple of days prior to the fight when I talked to him on Thursday after the press conference. It was and I spoke to him and Crawford within a few minutes of each other. It was my impression that he was definitely struggling at the weight. I even said it on one of our preview shows that we do on the Bet US gambling show that I co-host. That the weight was definitely, he looked a little slower. He walked with a different gait. You could tell he was struggling with the weight, but guys usually can bounce back from that with the period of time between when they do that and when they have the official weigh-in. But so, yeah, I do think the weight hurt him, but I can't tell you it's the reason he lost the fight, to make a long story short.
And a lot of people on social media come out and say that they thought the fight should have been stopped here. Derek James taking sort of things in his own hands. Do you think Derek James should have stopped the fight earlier?
No, I was okay with the way the fight was stopped. I mean, Derek obviously has his best interest in heart. They've been together for a long time. I think that Derek and Errol have a, similar to like a father-son or, older brother, younger brother kind of relationship. I respect Derek James a lot. I have no problem with the way the fight was stopped. I felt like the referee, Harvey Dock, did a tremendous job. He stopped the fight when it should have been stopped.
Definitely, that's fair enough. Another thing, when it always comes out with when people sort of have losses or take bad losses, Stephen A. Smith coming out and saying, and various other sort of media outlets coming out and saying that they think that Errol Spence should call it a day, should retire. How do you react to that?
I've heard that a million times after these types of fights, and I'm not one to just sort of jump all over the narrative. In respect to Stephen A. Smith, he's a boxing fan. Stephen A. has been a friend of mine for years. We worked together at ESPN for a long time. I've been on his radio show, been on his TV show many times. I like Stephen A. I would just respectfully disagree with his assessment.
That's completely fair enough. And another question I wanted to ask after we also, I mean, this week of boxing has been crazy in general. We see Naoya Inoue defeat Stephen Fulton, which was an incredible performance. And a question I wanted to have for you, in all the years that you've been covering boxing, have we ever seen a more competitive spot for the pound for pound number one, where you see so many good fighters achieving so much legacy?
I mean, we have definitely seen times where the top guys have fought in close proximity to each other. I don't know if we've seen it that I can think of anyway. And I was thinking about this. If we've seen them fight within literally like 4 days or 5 days of each other, and the opponent that they fought was perceived as by far their most toughest opponent of their career. Yeah. So when you're talking about Inoue and all the great things he had already achieved, winning the titles in the various weight classes he had been champion in, becoming undisputed at bantamweight, I don't think anybody, including Inoue himself, didn't think that Stephen Fulton, as the undefeated unified champion at 122 pounds, posed his biggest threat. And it turned out that he shredded him. And the same goes for Terence Crawford. For all the top names and guys he's fought through the weight classes of becoming a champion in 3 divisions, I don't think anybody thought that Errol Spence wasn't by far his toughest test, even if he thought Crawford was going to win the fight. So for them to both take on pound for pound level opponents who are both undefeated, who are both unified champions, and not just win, but do it easily. I made a joke. It makes me not want to see Crawford versus Inoue. You know what I mean? Obviously, not going to happen for the difference of the big weight disparity. But that's a good point. I mean, you have a real a 2-man race. That said, I do think that, all respect to Inoue, I don't think there's any way you can't have Terence Crawford number one pound for pound, because the Errol Spence mountain he had to climb, in my mind, was a much greater threat to him than anything Fulton had for Inoue. You know, I love the matchup between Inoue and Fulton, but I've and again, I'm not disrespecting Fulton, but I don't think he was on the same level as a fighter or in terms of accomplishment or the resume as there was for Errol going into the fight with Crawford. You know, no doubt about it that Fulton going in was a top 122 pounder out there. Yeah. But you know, if you just take a step back and look at the resume he had compared to what Errol had done over a longer period of time against a better quality of opponent, I feel like there's no doubt in my mind that Crawford is number one pound for pound. And frankly, if you're one of the people that on Tuesday morning, when that fight ended between Fulton and Inoue, and you were saying just make him number one, and they weren't even rethinking or remembering the fact that, you know, a few days later we're seeing Spence versus Crawford, and now you finally saw that fight and you're still going to keep Inoue number one, I just think you're being stubborn.
Yeah, absolutely. Another thing that you broke this morning, which was exciting news for, I mean, fans over my side. Agreed for a long time, we knew about it, but we finally got a date. Joshua Buatsi versus Dan Azeez, October the 21st in London. A big fight, especially not just on the domestic level, but big implications for the world level.
You know, look, and that's a good matchup. I mean, they're two guys who, you know, I'm not sure if they're on the same level yet as the top light heavyweights. Are they? Would you favor either one of them against a guy like Dimitri Bivol or Arthur Beterbiev? Yeah. You know, probably not. But as far as my good friends in the UK like to say, a good domestic dust up, number one. Yeah. Good matchup, undefeated guys, but also has stakes because the winner is going to become the WBA light heavyweight mandatory challenger and will represent the biggest win of either man's career, it seems to me. So I think that's an excellent matchup. I mean, I'm glad. I know that there was a lot of conversation that maybe it was going to happen in August, that obviously for whatever reason was not able to get done. So they'll go and they'll fight in October. I think that's a great main event for one of these the boxer cards that they put on Sky. And I hope that we'll have that fight somewhere on one of our broadcasters here in the United States, because I've been following Buatsi since the Olympics. Had a chance to meet him a couple of times over the years. And while I've never met Dan Azeez or interviewed him, I've watched a number of his fights, and he's the kind of guy, to me anyway, that has sort of come into his own a little bit more than he had. Like at one point, he was one of these guys where you're sort of like, well, yeah, maybe he's a prospect, maybe he's not. Yeah. But he's just kept winning. He's beaten some okay guys. He's gone overseas and fought in other countries, fought in France, I think, a couple of times. You know, he's a good-looking contender himself. So I think that's an excellent fight. And the winner of that fight, it's not going to just be handed this mandatory shot. A lot of times you see guys, they win an eliminator, but the opponent's really nothing to write home about. This is at least the type of eliminator where the guy that wins this fight is going to deserve to fight for a world title. So I think it's a really good fight. I was very pleasantly surprised that they had it down on the schedule. I was happy to break that news, and I hope we get a great fight.
Definitely. And as we just close this off, if you want to give it, as always, I'd like to give you a little plug for your newsletter, your podcast. I will link it in the description, but what can we look forward to going forward?
Well, the podcast, my partner and I, TJ Reeves, we have a blast doing it. We do it twice a week. We do it Thursday. It comes out Thursday night leading into the weekend. And then we do it again we'll tape it usually Sunday night coming out of the weekend to give all the results and whatever news is going on. We have a little bit of nostalgia. So we have a good time doing that. Because we're not usually together on Zoom, because I'm live here in Washington, D.C. area. He lives in Florida, but we were both at the fight in Vegas, where we actually were able to meet in person for the first time after doing our podcast together and our betting show together and working together on his Big Fight Weekend website for like a year and a half, but we never had met in person. So this time, not only we meet in person, we're able to do both of our podcasts, in person. So we did it, before the fight in the media center, did it after the fight up in my hotel room, which we have some funny back and forth. Anyway, so that's the podcast, and that's available anywhere you get your podcast, Spotify and Google Podcasts and Apple and all that business. And then the newsletter, I think people are coming around to it. They like it. I've heard lots of compliments, and I appreciate it. The Fight Freaks Unite on Substack, danrafael.substack.com. A lot of it's for free, but on a big week like Crawford and Spence, I had no choice to be able to finance these events and be able to make a living. A lot of it does go behind the paywall, but I believe that if you subscribe to it, you're going to get your money's worth, because I don't write like one story a week. You get a lot of material, and people have been supportive, and I appreciate it. So it takes 2 seconds to sign up, danrafael.substack.com. You put your email address in, you get everything right to you, or you can visit the website, or you can set up a phone alert, try to make it as easy as possible for you to read what I've got to say and what I've got to report.
100%. I'll definitely link that in the description. I'll definitely give it a recommendation. Dan, thank you for your time. Always a pleasure. I know it's been busy for Vegas for you, so I appreciate you giving time to speak to me on Zoom. So, I'm sure we'll be catching up soon.
Always a pleasure, Lewis. Thank you so much.